Modern presidents complain that the isolation of the office feels like being trapped inside a White House bubble. President Harry Truman famously called the White House, quote, the Great White Jail. And George W. Bush says it was like living in a museum. Veteran White House correspondent Kenneth T. Walsh has covered the White House for 27 years. He examines the life inside the bubble in his latest book called Prisoners of the White House. Ken also is senior White House correspondent for U.S. News and World Report, and he is joining us live from Washington, D.C. Ken, thank you so much for being here with us. This is so fascinating to me. I can sort of understand how the president is in a bubble, but what did you find? What's the real reason that the leader of the free world in some ways doesn't have touch with reality and the regular world we know about?
Right. Well, this has been going on for a long time. When I first started covering the White House back in 1986, it became clear to me how abnormal the life of America's president is. And there's a number of reasons for it. Everything's done for the president. He doesn't live a normal life in any way. He has everything he's handled, from his clothes to his purchases to his lawn is manicured, his parties are given for him. He doesn't have to go shopping. Air Force One is there that is always ready to take off and land. He never has to wait. And so just on the day-to-day existence level, it's much different. But it has other reasons that cause the isolation of the president. Security is a big one. Every time there's an incident of some kind involving security, the security gets more strict around the president. The assassination of President Kennedy, of course, the attempted assassination of President Reagan, 9/11, the terrorist attacks, and the security never gets more lax. The level of security always gets more and more intense. And so that's very limiting for a president. And then there's a natural instinct within a White House to protect the president, to shield the president. I call the folks in the inner circle of any president sort of the idolizers. They idolize the president. Obama is in this situation. Every president is. And they try to protect the president. You're seeing this now in this whole issue of the Internal Revenue Service. The president was kept in the dark about all this, according to White House officials, even though it's an issue that threatens trust in government. And you think that the White House officials would have told him, but he says and they say they kept them shielded from this. And it's part of a whole pattern that a president is in a bubble, and it's very difficult for a president to break out of it.
Yeah, I can see how it would be a two-edged sword. It would seem, tell us about the difference in the types of presidents. There are some presidents who really like to be in that bubble and insulate it a little bit more, if you will, and then others who work to break out of it. Break down which presidents were which.
Right. Well, in the book, I go back to Franklin Roosevelt, who I consider the first modern president, and he did try to break out of the bubble. He, of course, is beloved among many Americans for leading the country in World War II and through the Depression, but he had a real asset on his side to keep in touch, and that was Eleanor Roosevelt, his wife. She traveled around the country. Of course, Franklin Roosevelt had polio. His legs were paralyzed. He couldn't travel very well. So Eleanor did it for him. And she served actually as almost like a pollster and a reporter. She would go around the country. She went to coal mines, and this was unheard of at the time. She went to migrant labor camps. She went to ghettos and so on. And she then reported back to her husband on what she was seeing, on the hardships Americans were suffering through and so on. And he became to value this very much to keep him in contact with the country. And she did a very good job with that. And first ladies are very important in keeping presidents grounded. That's a very important part of this book, that first ladies are very important if presidents will listen.
Well, yeah, that's the key, isn't it, Ken? And, I hearken back to, remember Michelle Obama? She used to put great effort into humanizing Barack Obama, particularly even when they were campaigning, talking about how he didn't put his socks in the laundry basket, and really kind of revealed some of his humanity, we'll say. That can really help a president in terms of being able to relate to the people.
Sure, no, it can. And talking to a number of people at the Obama White House, Michelle is a very strong voice. And privately, she will tell the president when he did something she thinks he didn't give a speech very well, or he's not communicating something very well. The other interesting thing is the daughters, Sasha and Malia. President Obama tries to have dinner with them every night at 6:30, and he accomplishes that many times. He sits down with them, and from what I'm told, they're not very impressed with him as president. They just want to talk to Dad. And so he might be brought down a few notches when he sits at the table with these two girls, and they're more interested in talking about a boy at school who was mean to them, or a teacher who wasn't nice to them, and they just want Dad to listen to this. And so it's a very grounding experience, I think, for any president.
I bet it would be indeed. Let's talk a little bit about President George W. Bush. I understand that he didn't mind being in the bubble and perhaps sought refuge in it.
Right. Well, he's one of the examples I give of someone who sort of lost touch with the country, particularly during his second term. And there were two big problems he had in the second term. One was that the war in Iraq was not going well. A lot of people feel it was being mismanaged. But President Bush turned out to be a very stubborn president, and he didn't really listen to a lot of people who were telling him things. The other big example was Hurricane Katrina, the famous incident where he was in his ranch in Texas on vacation, and the country was seeing these terrible images of suffering, people without food or water, desperate for help, and President Bush was isolated from this. And finally, one of his staff members, in order to rivet his attention, put a video together to show the images that the country was seeing hour to hour on its television. But President Bush did not watch the news, and so he was isolated from that. And I just think it's an example of how easily, even when something is going on that everybody's paying attention to, presidents often don't pay attention to the news media anymore. And that was the case with President Bush.
And you also put in that same box those presidents who sort of lost touch. Richard Nixon, that kind of makes sense. Jimmy Carter, who was wildly unpopular while he was a sitting president, but became very popular as a former president. Even George H.W. Bush. Can you sort of track what would be perceived as the success of a presidential administration with how in touch they were or not in touch with the public in reality?
Right. Well, we can, yeah, I mean, it's interesting. In the book, I compare President Kennedy and President Bush the son as two sort of princes of American life, come from wealthy families, were insulated throughout their lives from everyday life in many ways. And then they came into office. The difference is that President Kennedy made the effort to learn about what was going on around the country. He took his polling is very important, and we can talk about that further if you'd like, but basically President Kennedy liked to get the numbers from his pollster, but he told the pollster, you give me the numbers, I'll figure out what they mean. And a lot of presidents don't do that. And he also paid attention to the media, was very impressed with the bravery he saw of the civil rights movement, and that turned him around on that issue. He came to really respect the civil rights movement, and by the end of his life, he was very much in favor of the civil rights movement. President Bush, the son, however, really was not in that category. He was not as flexible.
I know that you do cover the importance of polling in your book. Our viewers will have to just get the book. It's called Prisoners in the White House, The Isolation of America's Presidents and the Crisis of Leadership. Ken Walsh, thank you so much for taking some time with us.
Thank you.
And you are watching Arise America.